So the quick agenda for today. So we'll start with an overview of what is open source, go into a little depth on license types, why you do it. We'll go into why you should release open source, possible paths to commercialization of softwares, whether a for-profit or a nonprofit way, as well as the role that the Tech Licensing Office can play for you when you've developed the software at MIT. And then finally, we'll open it up to Q&A, but please feel free to ask questions in the chat throughout, and my colleague Ali will bring them up when appropriate. Perfect. So what is open source? I do not know the experience everyone in this group has with open source or software in general, but a piece of software is considered to be open source when you license it under an open source license type. So open sourcing has a variety of different license types. The Open Source Initiative is the leading group that actually determines what is constituted as an open source disclosure and what is not. Currently, there are well over 100 different open source licenses out there. We only use a few of them, but they can cover any sort of restriction or permissivity that you are looking for, and they are all available on the Open Source Initiative site. So the definition of open source is a software licensing type that allows for free use, modification, and sharing of an author's source code by the public. So one of the main requirements here is you need to publish the source code, which means anyone finding your code and utilizing it has access to everything you've coded, not just an executable. They can do anything with the code that they're able to, as long as it fits within the appropriate licensing type. So if you post something online on GitHub, users can utilize it how they're looking for. They can make derivatives and modifications, and they can share with either co-authors, the public, to continuously expand where your project reaches and those who can contribute. So like I said, with the tens, if not hundreds of open source license types out there, they have varying levels of freedom to use based upon which one it is. So there are very, very permissive license types, which you can view as almost public domain. So you put it out there, you're not claiming the copyright, you don't need any sort of attribution, and it's just out there for the world to use. And it can go all the way to restrictive as something called a copyleft license, which has restrictions on how you can distribute. One of the main requirements being you need to share under that specific license type. So there really is a wide breadth of these license types, and you can generally find one that fits the need you're looking for. But overall, the goal of open source licensing is to distribute these softwares publicly, and the hope is to improve upon them, expand the use through public collaboration, but also it can be a way to test your software up front, and then you take a non-open source version forward. So it's a really good developmental tool, but it's also how you build large, close-knit communities within the developer community. And if anyone in the group has interest, the Open Source Initiative also has a separate set of requirements within the open source definition, which speak more to the accessibility, that you cannot have any sort of inherent bias on who can access your code, what they can do with it. And it's really about keeping the availability of the code and the ability to contribute equitable for everyone. As long as you can get to the code, you can do what you want within the license type, and it doesn't matter who you are. So, as I said before, the Open Source Initiative has been around since 1998, and they are really the leading source of supporting open source licensing and putting out the general rules. Right now, I generally group the license types available for open source into two major categories. There are permissive licenses, which have very minimal restrictions, and there are copyleft licenses, which require at the highest level for anything developed utilizing that software as a piece of third-party code or within it needs to be released under the same license type. So in general, some examples, permissive licenses, you're much more likely to see in the individual developer community. So the MIT license is one of the licenses we support out of our office releasing software under. Please note the MIT license no longer has any direct affiliation to MIT, so Kevin and I are not the ones to reach out to with questions about that specific license type. It just has our name. There's an accompanying permissive license out there called a BSD license out of Berkeley, and I'm pretty sure both of these just started as a competition between MIT and Berkeley, but they're their own thing now. We are not the main source of knowledge when it comes to those. The Apache 2.0 license is growing and incredibly popular now among individual developers. So if you're working on a project outside of MIT, just work, you're the only contributor, you've created all of it. Apache has very similar permissions to the MIT and BSD licenses, meaning all you're required to do is include a copyright line, include a line that says you're providing the software as is, and it's not your fault if something happens with it. And then they require attribution. So if someone utilizes your code, they are then required to include within their license something that says you developed this piece of third-party code and it gives you the credit. And that's really the only requirement. The Apache license is, instead of being around 3 paragraphs, is I believe in the 5-page range now. It really does say similar things. The only major difference is there are other implications built within that have to do with intellectual property and sort of outside rights to intellectual property that you own. Generally, for individuals, this doesn't lead to an issue. You don't have a large patent portfolio or huge copyright portfolio. But in the case of someone like MIT or other large research institutions, we need to be more careful around this license type because MIT has such a large portfolio of intellectual property that there are claims within the license that could provide a form of free permission for someone to use related intellectual property. So we really try to avoid releasing under that one. On the other side of things, the copyleft licenses, like I referenced earlier, there's GPL and V2 and V3. So these are general public licenses. They're pretty equally prevalent now. They come from the same group, which is GNU. Like earlier, they do require what's called share-alike. So anything utilizing this code within is required to then release any future modifications developed under the same license type. So if something's out there under GPL v2, you have to release derivatives under GPL v2. And the same for v3. And although it doesn't make perfect sense, GPL v2 and GPL v3, although they come from the same company and try to do the same thing, they are completely incompatible. I don't know why they chose to take it this route, and it is very inconvenient for many people. But in this case, MIT much prefers the GPL v2 to v3 due to similar issues that arose with Apache. There are many other license types out there. I mean, there's something called the MIT Zero license that I learned about recently, and that basically just says the same as the MIT license, but doesn't require any attribution. And they range all the way to public domain and even more restrictive. So if you're looking to release a software open source, do your diligence when it comes to the license type and what you're hoping to happen with your software, but also within MIT, that's part of what Kevin and I are here for. Kevin, do you want to take open access?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Just one other thing on open source, kind of the types of licenses. One of the things to look out for, especially if you're working with third-party code or other collaborators, is kind of the non-OSI licenses, or kind of the homebrew licenses, we like to call them, where sometimes somebody creates a project and they'll put in the repository, a license that's very similar to a standard accepted, open source license, but has some tweaks to it. So just, when you're working with third-party code, especially, or even on your own code, check to make sure that you're not changing terms of an accepted OSI license. And that'll come into play a lot of times too, if you're working on sponsored research projects or even some government projects where a specific type of open source pathway is specified, and putting things out under kind of these homemade licenses can create problems going down the road. So one of the things we wanted to talk about a little bit about was open access. And if you're not familiar, MIT has an open access policy. We're an open access institution, and that really means that our research is intended to go out for the most public benefit that we can get. And there's a number of different pathways to do that. So open source is kind of just one pathway in the larger realm of open access. But you'll see other things that go out with licenses, especially if you're doing academic publications. Your theses, sometimes data sets get released, etc. And for those, typically, we see things like the Creative Commons license, which are the most commonly accepted one. And there's different types, just like there are different types with software. And so if you're working with software, one of the things that we see a lot is people that are working on publications that have a code requirement as well. So if you're publishing an article or a research paper that has associated software code with it, sometimes the publications will ask for that code to be also released under some form of open access or open source license. So that's one of the areas we can try to help out with, because sometimes you don't necessarily need to release the entire code of the project under that license. Maybe it's just some subset of the project that can be released under, a copyleft, or even just a non-commercial license for folks to kind of just prove out the research. But it's important to bear in mind that just because something is put in a paper, that doesn't necessarily mean it's released under a software open source license. The software licenses are specifically for copying and using the software in other projects, whereas open access licenses like Creative Commons are more in terms of straight copyright protection of the source material. So actually, we did have a question here. It's actually a good one. So does MIT prefer the MIT license, even though it's not directly affiliated now? And I think that the short answer to that is yes. And just because of, like Aidan was talking earlier, it's a relatively simple license. It doesn't have kind of overarching or overreaching clauses in it. And if you just want to get it out there under a simple license that has copyright attributions but not much restrictions, that's a great license to use. But one of the conversations, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later, that we try to have is that if you're releasing something with an MIT license, there may be other pathways too that might be better suited if you wanted to maintain some control for possible future commercialization or licensing, and sponsor types of activities. I think we can go to the next slide. Okay. Did you want to kick off this part, Aidan, or do you want me to start?
It's talking in the mute, but yeah, I can take it. So releasing open source has a variety of different sort of motivators behind it. You have the general camp of individual contributors who are really focused on collaboration, expanding use and availability, really pushing for the public good and improving. So that's really what you view as sort of the open source community. These are individuals and institutions working together on projects. The goal is not normally any sort of commercial success. It is build a project, continue to build it, increase the usefulness, and really get it out there for public use. On more of the corporate side of things, what we've been seeing for motivations or transparency has been really, really big. Companies are trying to put pieces of code out there so individual users end users or institutions like MIT can look into them, see how a company is doing what it's doing. And it's a really good PR look for these companies because they are showing something that is important to their company, making it publicly available for use, and allowing any user out there to at least at a high level understand what they're doing, how they're doing it. And it also limits any sort of questions when it comes to companies making negative choices when it comes to the software community, as in taking software from others without true permissions. So that's been really big, and public good for both individuals and corporations is becoming bigger and bigger. If you have your name as a person or a company on a project which is making huge influence across the world, whether it's just a base product that's being built upon, or a Python package that's used in every piece of code you see left and right, all of these support other projects, which in the end can support the public good and make improvements, whether it's through nonprofits or different directions taken by these commercial companies or individual users. There's also improvement and then requirements like Kevin talked about earlier, whether you're publishing a paper in Nature or other different articles, or a sponsor who funded your work has a requirement that it needs to go out there. There are different times where you as an individual will be required to release your software developed related to something under an open source license. And these come more into play when you're having initial discussions with companies about sponsorship, or you're choosing the papers to submit to. So in this case, the TLO, Kevin and I are always available for questions. We will say, come to us before releasing. It's a lot easier to change your mind before your code is out there publicly. The other two things we want to make really clear are when you release a piece of code open source, whether it's MIT's or yours, you're not giving up the ownership and you're not giving up the copyright. It is a license type, but you are not giving everyone the right to do anything they want with your software. It is still your software and your copyright. The other main point is the owner of the copyright. So whoever developed the code, whether it's an individual or MIT, you're not required to follow that open source license. So if you release a piece of code under a copyleft license that you've developed and you build upon it using it, you are allowed as the individual author or the creator to release under any sort of license type you're looking for. So there's no requirement, even though there's the share alike clause, but you do generally want to keep those things in line for future contributions to the project.
Yeah, and just to build upon that, and one of the biggest reasons we see people wanting to open source is that collaboration aspect. And at MIT, if everybody's working on a project and they're all subject to the MIT IP policy, there's really no issue. But what happens is when you create a repository, an open project, and you invite colleagues or other folks from other institutions or individuals to contribute to that, unless you have a very specific contributor license agreement posted along with your repository, what can happen is you kind of get this muddling of the ownership pool where, somebody, say you're working with somebody at another academic institution and they make changes and they commit them to the repository and the owner of the project accepts them into the repository. Now, technically that project has joint copyright ownership unless the contributor license agreement that was posted with the repository says otherwise. And the easiest one is the kind of standard, by contributing to this repository, I am, basically giving my copyright in my changes to the owner of this project. And that's something, if anybody ever has questions about CLAs or ways to structure a repository for, so that the licensing is clear and the requirements of the project contributions are also clear, then, please feel free to come to us and we can help you work through that. Because it is a problem sometimes when people realize 5-6 years down the road that this open source project that maybe they want to, spin off a variant and license it to another institution or to a company, has kind of a very muddy ownership path, because over those 5 years, you've had people from 17 different institutions contributing code changes and updates. So now it's not necessarily an MIT project anymore. It's a project that's got contributors from all of these institutions and no real kind of understanding of how you're going to administer that, other than having to get unanimous consent anytime you want to make any change to future licensing or things like that.
And there really are a variety of different release reasons beyond these. I mean, there are people at MIT even who anything they develop, they release open source. It doesn't matter if it's some breakthrough or something minor like an update. It's what they've chosen to do, and it's how they've chosen to do it. And MIT will always support you in an open source release as long as it fits within the requirements that we're given. So as long as we're using the right license type, we're not going against any compliance that has to do with things that have sponsored it. And for those working in labs, do talk to your lab lead or department head, whomever, if you're questioning whether or not something should be released. What we do like to avoid is having someone come to us, release something, and then have a co-author down the line say, why did you do this? So if you're starting to doubt things, ask someone in your lab, come to the TLO and ask Kevin or I. But again, it is much easier to change your choice before release than it is afterwards. Perfect. Yeah. So getting into more the commercialization of open source, and this is newer. Open source has not often been viewed as something commercial. You're releasing for the public good, collaboration, and use. So initially you view it as you can't build a company around this, there can't be money made around this. And I will say, for most people in the open source community, money is not a guiding factor. But there are ways out there now to commercialize software you've released open source. So one thing we talked about earlier was this idea that if you are the author of a piece of code and you release it under an open source license, you are not required to follow the same license. So a dual licensing model has been growing recently. We've been doing a lot more of it at MIT, whether it's purely on open source software or publicly released non-commercial softwares. But how this is done is you release code you've developed under a share-alike copyleft license, like GPL v2. You can put it out on GitHub, it's available, it's free for non-commercial use, but it still has that requirement to release anything you've developed with it under the same license type. So yes, a large tech company of the world could come take your software, utilize it in their commercial product, but due to the license type, they would then be required to release that commercial product under the same license type. And obviously, if a large company is putting hundreds of thousands of dollars and tens of thousands of hours into a project, they likely don't want to have to release it publicly. So where the dual licensing comes into play is then our ability to license that piece of software to the commercial company for which they can use commercially. So if we or you as a company were to license your open source software to another company, they are not required to follow the previous GPL v2 or copyleft requirement, and they can use it as a commercial product. So generally, if a tech company, like we talked about earlier, had developed something based on this, instead of being forced to release what they've developed under this copyleft license, they can come to MIT or come to you, work through a commercial license like you would for any other piece of intellectual property, and they can utilize it commercially. So this is happening across the board. One of the best MIT examples we have is if anyone has experience with FFTW, or the fastest Fourier transform in the West. This is a piece of open source software developed over the last 2 decades or so that is available online at their website under the GPL v2 license. Anyone can go take it, download it, utilize it, but you really can't get away with commercial use. So companies, contractors, anyone then come to MIT in this case to get a commercial license, and we've developed what we call an expedited license. So in this case, we really don't have ongoing negotiations with them. They pay us an upfront fee, they get the software, they can do what they want with it, but they don't have to follow the open source license. They have been really successful in this model, and more companies seem to be doing it. But you do need to be careful here that you're selecting the right license type and you're releasing under a copyleft. If you put your software out there under a permissive license like MIT, we no longer have the share-alike protection. So this company can come in, utilize your code however they please, and all they're required to in that case is to give you attribution as a third-party code contributor. So you're not really going to be able to commercialize it. I will also point out, although it's not technically an open source license, Kevin and I more recently have been dealing with what we're calling a non-commercial academic research license. So it still allows you to post your code on GitHub, wherever you're hoping to host it, and you just include this license type with it. No signatures required, but instead of being a purely recognized open source license, this allows other academic researchers, other researchers at nonprofit institutions to use your code, work on it, similar to it being like an open source license, but it much more explicitly points out commercial use is not allowed. So we view it as more of an open source light, and this would not technically be considered an open source license, but it's how we've been bridging the gap between making code available for researchers, but having stronger commercial protections because open source by some is viewed as too publicly available. Kevin, do you want to take the other two?
Sure. So we'll talk a little bit about the some of the business models that are also out there. So, you know, I think Aiden said it earlier is, you know, people think once you release open source, there's nothing else you can do with the software. You know, maybe you're thinking about a startup or another company that takes that software and goes into kind of the next level of development or improvements of the software. But you know, there are successful businesses out there that that are foundationally built on open source software projects. So kind of what one that we talk about a lot is the open core model, where there's a kind of core functionality of software that's released as a project out there, and then the business in a lot of cases develops additional modules or customized versions of those types of software projects for specific companies. So, you know, it's one of those things where a company could go out and hire 50 engineers to take the open source project and adapt it to their specific needs. Or, you know, they contract with a company to give them a specific version of it, or to add improvements or add-ons or features, modules, you name it. And then that becomes the business model of the company. And the second one is kind of that support model where you have companies that are explicitly built around providing services and support for various open source projects. So, you know, I think the biggest one is Red Hat. You know, they took the software, you know, and basically create versions of it or provide support or packages that are specifically targeted for you know, specific processors or optimizations, you name it. But you can build a company around these types of services and still have, you know, at the end of the day, the end goal is your software is out there for maximum impact for people. It's just that you're able to provide expertise and services and additional software as a business, possibly going forward. So that's part of what we talk about. When we do have those initial discussions with a software disclosure that might be requested for open source, or if you just call us up and say, "Hey, I have this project. I'm thinking about, what are my options in terms of commercialization, if that is a goal." So one of the things we'll look at is, is it something that would fall under one of these models, potentially like the dual license, or is this, again, do you release some smaller uh, set of the software as a kind of the core modules, we like to call it, and then you kind of, license out the additional improvements or other modules going forward. Let's see. I think next, you know, yeah, so you can look at some great examples of companies that have gone out and in a lot of cases made quite a good chunk of change supporting and developing for open source projects. Linux, obviously, you've got Mozilla, Red Hat, GitHub, of some of the more notable ones. But for every major one, there's probably hundreds, if not thousands, of other ones out there that are some more supporting smaller projects and more specialized types of repositories.
Yeah, and just adding on to that, I mean, there's these companies and these projects out there, but every major tech player out there has their hands in some open source project. There's a lot from Google, a lot from Meta, across the board. And as things grow, one of the methods they tend to use as a form of both contributing to the open source community, but still supporting the company financially will be releasing alpha versions of software out there. So their V1, they'll put it out there open source. Users will contribute, find the bugs, promote or point out different functionalities that could be used. And then down the line, the company can take these contributions, create a V2, V3, whichever, and that can be released non-open source as a product. Again, every major tech player you can think of is doing something like this. But the one main thing I do want to point out, especially from a TLO perspective, is just because you're bringing a piece of open source software to us does not mean we're going to push you to commercialize it. We are just as supportive of releasing software under permissive licenses for anyone to use. So do not stop yourself from reaching out to us just because you think we might try and just take your code and run with it and turn it into a company. That is not our goal. We're maximizing impact, not revenue.
Yeah, and I think to echo the prevalence of open source software um, in just in companies in general. I think back to my time as a developer for a long time. Um, there was not this accepted understanding amongst corporate leadership, especially in some of the hardware centric industries, regarding the use of open source. There was kind of this idea that everything open source was copyleft, and it was just don't touch it because it's going to mess up our product plan or product path. But I think there's been a vast shift towards companies understanding what open source is, how it works as an asset. If you have any kind of electronic device that tells you its credits or its license file, you'll probably see, dozens, if not, more of open source licenses that are integrated to these projects. Even your television, if you go to the about, it'll probably scroll through about 15 to 20 different licenses that have been released open source and are incorporated into that commercial software. So yeah, it is something that I think, as Aidan said, the companies are using it a lot more and not just kind of pushing it away because it wasn't developed in-house. There's an inherent value to open source projects and bringing them in rather than having to develop something from scratch on your own.
Yeah. And just to add, you don't need to be a company. You do not need to be super influential in your field or one of the best coders in the world. Anyone can contribute to open source. Even if you're just learning how to code, you can find a project out there fork it so you're not messing with the source code that someone else released, and do what you want with it, play with it, and you're contributing to the community, but the open source community is equitable. There's no requirement to have a PhD. There's no requirement to work for a big tech company. Anyone can contribute. It's a really, really good way to learn and build up a portfolio if you're getting into computer science. So do not ever feel limited by the size of a project or if it looks complicated or important people are contributing. Take a look at it, take a crack. Maybe you'll be the one to figure something out no one has before, or maybe you'll just have a fun couple days messing with something, seeing what you can do and learning. So the open source community is open to anyone. I've contributed now. I really do not have a large software background at all, but I've learned along the way, and Google and other developers are always going to be your best friend. Everyone in this community will answer a question for you either on GitHub or on Stack Overflow, different resources. So it really is collaborative and across the board from single people to the largest companies you can think of. So the last thing we wanted to get into before questions and any other way we can help is just pointing out what MIT's Tech Licensing Office can do to help you when it comes to open source software. So we do provide a variety of roles, and open source is not the only thing Kevin and I do. We work with general non-open source copyrighted software, licensing that side of things, patenting. So that's normally what people view the TLO as. But in terms of the open source side of things, one of the best things you can do if you have any questions is to reach out to us. There's a general TLO email. If you don't know exactly who you want to reach out to, you can always reach out to Kevin or I. We'll have our emails at the end. But initially, we try and provide guidance. We'll let you know if we think open sourcing a project is appropriate and or allowed. If your sponsor says no, we're not going to do it. If there are other issues, whether they range from just compliance with third-party code to as far as export control and national security, depending on the field you're working in, we'll help you determine if it's okay. We'll help you figure out when and how are the best ways to open source your software or data. And right now, when I'm saying open source, I'm including open access within there. Software, open source, data, open access. It's the easiest way to keep them split, but we'll let you know, is it too early to release something? Have you developed a product to the point of maybe you can do something more with it than just post it and forget? And finally, we can provide support under the best license to release under. Like I said, between open access, open source, there are tens, if not hundreds of different license types. We have our preferred at the TLO, which I can list right now is the MIT and BSD licenses for permissive, and the GPL v2 and LGPL v2, which is a more permissive version of GPL. We really prefer to stick to those ones because there aren't any legal terms within them that put MIT at risk, but we can answer which we think is the best. I think the biggest thing we always tell people is it is a lot easier to move from more restrictive to less restrictive, so copyleft to permissive, than it is the other way around. Open source is not something you can really change your mind on. If you put a piece of code out there under any open source type, if someone has a copy of that code with that license type on it, they are free to use it based on that license, even if you've changed your mind. So maybe you release something open source under an MIT license, which allows people to do whatever they want with it. And then a month down the line, you realize this is a groundbreaking piece of code you've developed that, oh no, you don't want everyone to have access to. We can't change that. You can pull as much as you want from the web, but whoever's used it and has it with that license can follow that license, and there's no requirement that they update it. So come talk to us. We'll let you know what's appropriate, and If you don't open source something, you can always open source it in the future. And if you more restricted open source it, you can always make it more permissive. But the other way around is effectively impossible for us to fix. As well as all of that we provide guidance on, we'll review compliance with either third-party code, which we've talked about before. One of the big things to point out here are you're required to follow the license type of any piece of third-party code you use that is embedded within your software. So if when a user is downloading your software, they're also downloading a piece of code someone else developed, then we're required to follow that license. So if you're using something under copyleft and you want to release MIT, that doesn't work. If you do what's called dynamically link your code, which is effectively you tell a user, go download this separate package, and then it will be implemented within this code. But in that case, because the user is downloading on their own, they're the one taking on the requirements of the license type, not MIT. So we're then no longer required as MIT to abide by that. So a lot of the time, if we get code and there's an issue with third-party code, we'll work with researchers to see if they can remove a bit of code or fork it and make it accessible. And in that case, it won't hold us up in releasing. And then finally, the last two things are more on the commercialization side of things, but we can provide options for possible next steps. So maybe you want to do more than just release your piece of code online and move on from it and just have the community. Maybe you want to start a full project and we can point you to resources on how to maintain these projects, how to possibly find funding. There's more and more of that coming out for open source projects, and other routes you might want to take, like working with other companies on sponsored research and a variety of different ways. And if you do come down to the point of wanting to, or at least considering commercializing, we have connections with a variety of entrepreneurship resources across MIT. And I mean, MIT is a very good place to be into entrepreneurship. There are more resources than I can count, ranging from venture and accelerators to programs at MIT that'll teach you how to build a company, how to take it, and how to move it forward. So not only will we provide you guidance and reviews, but we will make sure that we're sending you to the correct people if you want to move forward. And the one last thing I really want to note on this is the TLO wants to be a resource. We don't want to be a bottleneck. So do not view us as someone who's going to slow you down and waste your time and then avoid disclosing to us. We're here as a resource. We would love to review everything going out. We know that's not realistic. There's too much code coming out of MIT, and not everyone discloses to us, and that's okay. But if we can support you, we're willing to support you, and we're a resource. We can answer a quick question over email, hop on a quick Zoom to discuss something, but we're not going to make you wait 6 months to release something you've developed. I will say, if you have certain federal agencies funding you, they might make you wait 6 to 24 months to release something, but I've only dealt with that a few times, and most people don't have to deal with it.